Like people like Owen didn't really take the common people as he found them. Rather, he is more typical of educated opinion in worrying that the wage-earning class was peculiarly degraded. He argued, however, that human nature was essentially plastic and could be improved and the proletariat saved by improving their social conditions. His vision was essentially paternalistic, even rather authoritarian. Close direction, he felt, could radically reshape human nature. Man may be trained to acquire any sentiment and habits or any character. Owen condemned cutthroat, devil take the hindmost competition as encouraging the worst attributes, human attributes of cruelty, selfishness, domineering, and servility. Cooperative production and education, he proposed, would eliminate both the degradation of proletarianized labour and the ruthlessness of the capitalist. He proposed manufacturing colonies, running cooperative lines, paying attention not simply to production, but also to the physical, moral, and educational welfare of workers and their families. An incorrigible optimist, Owen thought that in a better organised society, when people enjoyed the daily bath, when people enjoyed having a daily bath, even clothes would become largely superfluous in the English climate. He could not see a problem that could not be easily solved. Robert Owen had little time for prioritising political or democratic reform as such. He saw no reason why his colonies could not be sponsored by wealthy aristocrats in the here and now, and he did not expect any particular advance in worker interests would come through mere franchise reform. He did not think either that worker self-organisation would have any particularly beneficial impact upon a wage earner culture or morale. It is more likely, he felt, things like trade unionism to promote a bitter and narrow class consciousness and unwarranted hostility to employers and the wealthy. At best, worker self-organisation, which he felt if it happened should repudiate class struggle ideology, would be only one means to end towards the end of a more rational and collective organisation of society. Particularly in his earliest years of propagandizing, Owen was inclined to believe that reform could not be expected to derive from this unregenerate mass of the proletariat, and he appealed instead to the elites. As he said in 1917, the gentlemen who opposed my plan at public meetings did not imagine I wished to have the opinions of the ill-trained and uninformed on any of the measures intended for their relief and amelioration. No, on such subjects, until they shall be instructed in better habits and made more rationally intelligent, their advice can be of no value. He's talking about the working class here. At first, Robert Owen's proposals did attract a good deal of sympathetic attention from the wealthy and aristocratic, though Owen himself probably exaggerated that. This soon faded, however, and though Owen never gave up on convincing all classes of the wisdom of his proposals, he began to look elsewhere for at least immediate support. Owen then began to appeal directly to workers from about 1819, though in a particularly paternalistic fashion. In his most substantial work, Report on the County of Lanark, published in 1820, Owen propounded a new doctrine of value and exchange and proposed that money as it existed should be replaced by a new currency based upon socially necessary labour time, so that workers could secure themselves through mutual exchange without the intermediary of the capitalist. Owen critiques the system, but is certain that all can be brought to realise the benefit of its reform. The rich and the poor, the governors and the governed, have but one interest, he said. For Owen, it is up to the state to foster collective enterprise that in turn would civilise the workers. Owen left Britain in 1824 to set up model communities in the United States, notably at New Harmony in Indiana. These experiments failed, but Owen never lost faith in himself. Indeed, his ideas evolved in increasingly heterodox, particularly critical of religion, directions, and he despised and he posed fundamental criticisms of religion and marriage that tended to eliminate any remaining socially respectable sympathy. Workers in trade unions and radical political organisations, however, were taken by Robert Owen's optimistic vision of a future in which wage earners might have security and autonomy. While Owen himself thought in terms of moulding the psychology of the working classes, many of his working class followers were more interested in the potential of a system to secure for them a form of independence for the wage worker equivalent to that enjoyed by the small property owner. There also developed in the 1820s a working class socialism which attempted to repurpose free market political economy for working class ends. These Ricardian socialists, as they're now collectively known, after David Ricardo, the economist who had proposed the idea of the labour theory of value or developed that theory. This is picked up by the Ricardian socialists. To some extent, they were filling in the gap left by Owen on his emigration to America. However, they were more influenced by the philosophical radicals, people like Bentham and Mill, and therefore who were strenuously pro-free market, but also radically critical of state paternalism. And these Ricardian socialists were inclined more so than Owen to see a virtue in worker self-organisation as an end in itself. They were generally suspicious of state intervention and favoured instead trade union collective bargaining in the 1820s as a period of the struggle led by people like Francis Place for the legalisation of trade union self-organisation. So they favoured trade union self-organisation and or cheap credit, which would undermine the artificial monopoly, as they saw it, of capital, which is enjoyed by the industrialists and landlords. So a significant Ricardian socialist was Thomas Hodgkin, 1787, 1869, a journalist and a supporter of the campaign for the right to trade unionists to organise legally. In 1827, Hodgkin published under the pen name A Labourer his Labour Defended Against the Claims of Capital. Hodgkin saw his work not so much as enlightening the workers, as rather attempting to take the instinctive political and economic claims of the workers and moulding them into scientific form. He drew upon the accepted labour theory of value to be found in Adam Smith and the political economists to demonstrate, as he hoped, that as the creators of all value, the workers had the right to dispose of society's wealth. Importantly, Hodgkin's justified his writing not as a means of revealing to workers the true nature of their condition. This was, he believed, intuitively obvious for any wage earner. Rather, workers should educate themselves in economics in order to combat the sophistry of the capitalist class. As he put it, the labourers indeed are so satisfied that by their exertions all the wealth of society is produced that no doubt in the subject, labourers are satisfied that by their exertions all the wealth of society is produced, that no doubt in the subject has ever entered their minds. But this is not the case with other people. So workers intuitively understood they created wealth of society. It was other classes that had to be convinced of this. He did not, therefore, believe that wage earners laboured under a false consciousness as to their genuine interests. Rather, the worker instinct that they produced all the wealth of society was fundamentally correct and vindicated by a correct understanding of political economy. Workers were justified in believing that the capitalist middleman could and should be cut out. Enterprises could easily cooperate amongst themselves because, as the political economists had shown, the division of labour was not an artificial arrangement reliant upon expertise from on high, but was rather inherent in human nature. It is true, Hodgkins admitted, that in the present state of development, the wage-earning working class was not in a position yet to displace the capitalist middleman. However, he is confident that industrialisation was developing the capacities of the wage-earning working class that would, quite rapidly, allow it to produce its own multifarious worker capitalists, if you like, workplace collective capitalists, so long as they had sufficient wages in order to set themselves up. So really what the workers needed to do was to increase their wage share, to use this wage share to set themselves up as in cooperative enterprises, which would compete and outcompete with the capitalists. As he put it, the spread of education amongst the journeyman mechanics of the country diminishes daily the value and labour. The spread of education among the journeyman mechanics of this country diminishes daily the value of the labour and skill of almost all masters and employers by increasing the number of persons who possess their peculiar knowledge. That is, workshop workers were developing those skills which allowed them to operate their own enterprises without the intermediary of capitalist managerials. So in many respects, Hodgkin was producing an artisanal ideal, the artisanal workshop. Wage earners would escape from dependence by establishing themselves, in essence, by small property owners, even if this small property would have been a collective cooperative property in the workshop. It would be sustained by free exchange with other such workshop enterprises. And would be able to carry on without carrying the burden of profits being creamed off by capitalists who monopolise the means of production and credit. In all of this, for Hodgkin, there was no role for the state. Hodgkin indeed was extremely hostile to state control, and in later life he is to gravitate towards a more mainstream version of liberalism. Indeed, he became a steady writer for that impeccably laissez-faire a journal, which you'd all know, The Economist. Another Ricardian socialist is John Gray, born probably about 1798, died in 1850. More directly a disciple of Robert Owen. In contrast to Hodgkin's small property ideal, Gray emphasised that that market integration had already advanced beyond the point where the economy could be broken into small, self-sufficient units. It is already beyond the point of the small workshop. However, the subordination and loss of independence of the worker was not an inevitable consequence of this market integration. An integrated commercial society, rather, simply demanded that there had to be some rational plan of articulation of the entire economy. And such a rational plan was the only way to preserve the personal autonomy of the worker within the structure. In 1831, Gray wrote, "So soon as man becomes a member of a commercial society, so soon as he consents to form a part of one stupendous whole, from that moment, a controlling and directing power is as essential to the right working of the aggregate of commerce as it is to an individual manufacturing." By this, I do not mean that the taste and inclinations of the individual members of society are to be interfered with. What I contend for is a controlling and directing power to take in hand the whole of our commercial affairs. And I contend, moreover, that individual freedom and independence can never exist in any commercial society without it. So his idea here is preserving individual worker autonomy via a rational, articulated overall plan. The controlling centre he proposed should be money based on labour values to facilitate the equitable exchange between working producers. Gray, like Hodgkins, did not believe that wage earners were yet capable of arranging mutual exchange in this scale. To make themselves capable, they must shed their ingrained sense of inferiority inculcated by the social elites' disdain for productive labour. Systematic education, organised by the state, could do much to overcome this prejudice against working for one's own subsistence. Gray's understanding of the emancipatory potential of an integrated commercial society, however, did not appear to extend to what we'd understand as modern industry. His optimism that workers could be elevated seemed to apply only to the rural and artisanal trades. Wage earners in large-scale industry were a different matter. As Gray put it, a man may sow corn and reap it, he may manufacture goods and sell them, and all this may be rendered quite consistent with the character and feelings of a gentleman. But mining, the more laborious occupations in foundries, and some others, appear to require a condition of bodily toil which is very inconsistent with our present notions of refinement. No doubt. Gray was, like most Ricardian socialists, opposed to capitalism, which he saw as an unfair private monopoly of the means of production and credit. His socialism, however, would retain private production and exchange, but the means of production would be owned by those who worked them. He still saw the artisan, rather than the degraded industrial wage worker, as the foundation for working class self-organisation. The Ricardian socialists in general did not share the political radicalism and the burning desire for reform of the parliamentary franchise that animated the radical followers of people like William Cobbett, Arthur Hunt, and others. Generally speaking, they were not political democrats. One important exception was the Irish Owenite, William Thompson. While opposed to bitter class conflict, Thompson put much more emphasis than Robert Owen on the direct action of the producing working class. And to this end, Thompson, almost unique amongst the Owenites and indeed the Ricardian socialists, favoured political democracy as the most effective way of empowering the workers. William Thompson, 1775 to 1833, was born of a rich Protestant working class landowning family in Cork in Ireland. He came across the ideas of Saint-Simon, who we'll come back to, his ideas in the continent, but is also deeply indebted to the British utilitarianism of people like Bentham and Mill. The combination of these ideas brought him into the following of Robert Owen, but he rejected Robert Owen's paternalism. From the outset, Thompson was instinctively repelled by Owen's hobnobbing with the elite. Such is my love of freedom and exertion and all its consequences, he wrote, that I turned away with disgust from the system, which seemed to me to court the patronage of non-representative lawmakers. Thompson's first major book, coming in at a weighty 276,000 words, was called An Inquiry, or subtitled, no, actually, this is the whole title, An Inquiry into the Principles of Distribution of Wealth Most Conducive to Human Happiness, applied to the newly proposed system of voluntary equality of wealth. He always overwrote Thompson. Published in 1824. In this, he based his reasoning on Bentham's principle that all people desired security. Robert Owen considered that human nature was ultimately radically plastic. I think William Thompson's quite different. He bases his theorizing on a core constituent of human nature, the desire for security. The competitive economic system of capitalism, incidentally, he coins the word competitive. William Thompson invents that term. The competitive economic system offered no security to the worker. Workers could only find security in a system of cooperative production based upon the equal exchange of products created by equivalent social labour. This, he said, would be nothing less than a complete system of universal insurance against all casualties. So you can see the importance here of security. However, it must be stressed that for Thompson, cooperative production would first and foremost secure the independence of the worker. Protecting him or her from misfortune was a means to this end. Workers, Thompson insisted, thirsted, as he put it, for self-government, for autonomy. And this is a second part of his definition of human nature. And so Thompson very enthusiastically addressed mechanics institutes, kind of organizations usually set up by paternalists, specifically for the working classes. Mechanics, he said, govern yourselves, regulate your own affairs, employ permanent teachers, communicate knowledge impartially to all. Do this and you'll make your institution really useful. One of the most powerful means of regenerating the human race. Thompson was a convinced believer in worker self-organization as being a good in itself. He was not of the opinion that workers required external tutelage. So in 1827, Thompson published Labour Rewarded as a reply to Thomas Hodgkin. Here he rejected the latter's hostility to trade unionism and the collective political organisation of the workers. He thought that Hodgkin's allowed far too much room for intellectuals in the workers' movement. Moreover, while Hodgkin's favoured a consistently competitive economic system, even one which didn't give a particular advantage to owners of capital, Thompson believed that competition itself must be eliminated in favour of cooperation. A competitive system, remember he invented the term, simply created misery for workers and engendered periodic crises. And so Thompson, interestingly, opposed what he called a newly emerging aristocracy of talent. A good society should not be geared to rewarding only those who happen to be naturally gifted or blessed with educational advantages. The utilitarian principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number required that social organisation benefit all, regardless of arbitrarily defined merit. Moreover, a cooperative economy guaranteeing remunerative work for all itself created the best conditions for the realisation of all individuals' human potential. Thompson argued that only workers could decide their own affairs, and he proposed that they organise themselves into communes and elect provincial, state, and national legislatures. Thompson thus was both a radical socialist and a radical democrat. To this may be added his precocious feminism and his cheerful indifference to religion, which generally avoided Robert Owen's rather tiresome didactic mode of atheism. In his will, Thompson forbade any priest, whether he be Christian, Mohammedan, or Hindu, to have any role in his burial. Thompson was practically minded, and he left a sum of £4,000 to the disposal of the cooperative movement. This was disputed by his family, and the case was marooned in the Irish Court of Chancery for more than 25 years. One thing which is frustrating for an Irish historian, amongst other things, and frustratingly, in his voluminous writings, Thompson basically never mentions Ireland. However, I think if you read him very carefully, you can see intimations of a practice which is not yet adequately understood in a Irish kind of peasant economy called mithiel in Irish, or neighbouring or mooring, which is basically an exchange of labour. It does not mediate it by money, but it's a direct exchange of labour, which is very common in a pre-famine Irish economy. It's something in parallel to if we think about what do you call them? Not the Jehovah's, those kind of pleasant American kind of Christians who dress up. the ones again, you all get together to build barns, that kind of stuff. You know? It's a term in Ireland that they used at the time because it's not just a Catholic thing; it's a Protestant thing too. Protestants tend to call it mooring or neighbouring. That is, you help out your neighbour. And it does seem to have translated to America fairly directly. One thing I've noticed a few times from reading the novels and short stories of Stephen King, who's a very good observer, actually, of kind of rural and small town life, is that King a few times talks about neighbouring as a social practice, which still exists in America, of helping out the neighbours, of a mutual exchange of labour. This is very, very common in pre-famine Ireland. And as I say, it's the Irish language term is Mithiel. And one thing I've been doing is trying to track down evidence about this, which has been rather scanty up to now, but I've tracked down quite a lot of evidence about it now from the pre-famine period. And I think if you read Thompson carefully enough, through his use of language, you can see reflections. You can see that Thompson, he would have been aware of this practice, has it in mind. He talks about a cooperative rather than a competitive economy, but he's never explicit about this, which is very frustrating. Thompson's great, by the way. He's the best of the British-Irish utopian socialists. Jumping forward a little bit to Chartism, if there's any significant intellectual fellow traveller for Chartism, there's probably John Francis Bray, whose Labour Rewarded and Labour's Remedy, 1839, was a standard work, if there was any, for the movement when it comes to political economy, discussion of what the future might look like. Bray, 1818 to 1876, was actually born in Washington, D.C., but was taken as a boy to England in 1822. By 1835, he is working as a print compositor in Leeds and as treasurer of the town's Working Men's Association. Now, Bray did not deny that workers under present conditions were degraded, content to plod through life not as a man, but as an animal. But he pressed workers to assert themselves and to develop their own leadership. For Bray, therefore, the worker movement was ill-equipped by its social base to develop the intellectual resources for its own emancipation. However, he felt it had no option but to strive for remedial reforms that would give it sufficient leisure to educate itself. Allies drawn from other classes must inevitably bring with them their own prejudices and assumptions contrary to the interests of the worker movement. They were needed, but they'd always be problematic. Bray combined Hodgkins and Owen to argue that workers were exploited because of their lack of ownership of their own productive property. He argued, therefore, for the community of possessions that would give to every man that true independence which, under the present system, must ever be unknown to the workman. The reconstituted independence of the workman, moreover, would give rise to a new high level of mutual interdependence by showing to all men that their dependence on all proved to them that man has no preeminence above his fellow man. Bray's optimism that the Chartist movement could help educate the worker movement at large appears to have diminished quite rapidly, and after the first wave of Chartism ran into the sand, Bray returned to America in 1842. I'm going to turn now to the continent. First to Jean-Charles Sismondi, 1773 to 1842, born in a French-speaking district of Switzerland. He came himself from a socially privileged family. Switzerland, however, was the classic country of the sturdy, independent proprietor, and Sismondi was himself an enthusiastic partisan of small-scale peasant holdings. Painfully aware that commercial society was undermining this small-scale peasant property, he wanted the state to intervene to favour their existence. Buttressing peasant proprietorship, he argued, made good sense as commercial capitalism tended towards social instability and collapse due to its recurrent crises of underconsumption due to the hammering down of wages. Wage workers were inclined to class antagonism against their masters, the masters they were unwillingly dependent upon. Order, therefore, good order in society, Sismondi argued, relied upon a strong property-owning peasantry, and that's the class he identified with. It was, however, Sismondi who first used the term proletaires. That is, he more or less introduced the term proletariat, though he uses the term only fleetingly. It seems to be he who introduces the term into the language. He was referring back to the old notion of the proletaires of the ancient Roman society, those who contributed nothing to the state except their children, as that's what the term more or less meant. And Sismondi used the term to describe those workers who, by virtue of their lack of property and reliance upon an unreliable and unstable labour market, were unable themselves to rationally plan ahead. In France, Sismondi calculated they comprised about 5 million out of a population of 30 million in the 1820s. Now, Sismondi came from a Protestant Huguenot background. Jean-Marie de Lamennais, 1780-1860, was in contrast a Breton Catholic priest. Lamennais criticised those socialists who called for the abolition of individual private property, as this, he believed, struck at the root of liberty and morality. Private property is the basis of liberty and morality. Instead, he posed a Catholic critique of capitalism. He hoped to see constructed a social system in which everybody would become a proprietor. So he's against capitalism because capitalism dispossesses the great majority by concentrating ownership into the hands of a small capitalist elite. He wanted the distribution of property to a greater number as possible. And this, he believed, could be achieved through the diffusion of credit. That is, rather than having capital concentrated in a few hands, you diffuse capital as broadly as possible back through the democratization of credit, of making money available, so that everybody would have access to ownership of the instruments of labour. Now, these ideas of Lamennais clearly had a great deal in common with the Ricardian socialist notions current in Britain. After some soul searching, they kind of thought, oh, maybe it's all right, I'm not sure. But Lamennais was repudiated ultimately by the Roman Catholic hierarchy. He continued to write, however, and by the 1830s, and this, we see this with other people, having been turned away by respectable society, he was himself addressing the proletarians, as they are called, with a superb disdain. You can see that proletariat initially is quite an insulting term. He was of the view that proletarianization generated a class envy against property owners, which was wholly destructive. The wise state, he believed, would prevent the pell-mell capitalist expansion of this suffering and socially dangerous proletarian class. So if Sismondi and Lamennais were zealous defenders of small-scale property as the basis of good order and independent citizenship, Fourier anticipated for the immediate future mostly rural cooperatives, which would aggregate small-scale producers. Charles Fourier, 1772 to 1837, had himself lived through the Great French Revolution. A commercial traveller, he found himself in Lyon when it fell into the hands of royalist forces, for who he is forced to fight, and his goods were confiscated by the troops of the Revolutionary Convention when they seized Lyon back. This, however, allowed himself to commit himself to studying, and he became fascinated by the sciences and, of particular significance, music. The harmonies of music become very important to his way of thinking. So Charles Fourier, as he found harmony in music, so he believed he found harmony, or at least potential harmony within society. And so he developed a theory of social reorganization, and in 3 articles attempted to win the interests of the Bonapartist regime. From 1822, however, he began publishing longer works outlining his complex and often fantastical ideas. He projected future stages of society emerging from what he described as present civilization, which would be superseded by guaranteeism, which had promised the right to work and livelihood, which in turn would prepare man for a higher associative order, which would culminate ultimately in harmonism. Fourier believed that production and society should be moulded around human capacities. Stress this a little bit. Whilst Robert Owen stresses that human nature is plastic and you should change it and you can change it, Fourier is more interested in trying to understand human nature and how you can construct a better society around it. He laid special emphasis on the desirability of workers changing their jobs frequently so as to avoid stultifying boredom and the narrowing of pleasures. So he's always thinking about how you can take elements of human nature, some of it's slightly ridiculous. So he says, well, future society has to deal with things like sewage and dirty water and excrement and things like that. Nobody really wants doing that kind of job, you know, except for children. You know, they love playing in the mud and stuff. So we get the kids to deal with the sewage system and they'll enjoy it, you know. So he has all kinds of notions like that. But he does have a rather more compelling notion that, you know, individual people quite like change, you know, quite like doing different things to avoid boredom and the narrowing of pleasure. Jobs should be changed quite frequently. He projected famously what he called phalanxes, that is, associations, which he thought of as being a perfect ratios of trades that comprise about 1,000 to 2,000 persons, and that combine the best of two worlds. That security of property is characterized by petty production, combined with the creative scope and cooperation which necessarily combined the emerging larger scale capitalist production. These would be cooperative, but unlike Robert Owen's colonies, would not be rigidly egalitarian. Rather, he thought that the profits of the phalanx would be distributed between capital, labour and talent at proportions of 5, 4, 3. So whoever contributed capital gets 5, whoever contributes labour gets 4, whoever contributes talent would get 3. In preparation, Fourier proposed as a practical and an immediate reform the establishment of credit and marketing cooperatives for rural districts and for agricultural products. So he's quite a practical thinker in many respects, but also he's a thinker, thinks in terms of the cosmological. The final harmony of society, he believed, was assured by the laws of the universe. Just as Isaac Newton had discovered the forces of attraction between material objects, he had discovered spiritual forces of attraction and cooperation. He was convinced, therefore, that his own theories were scientific rather than utopian. He still tends to be called a utopian socialist for the not bad reason that he expected in a future state of harmonism, that society, the cosmos, to be so in balance and regulated that lions would be replaced by anti-lions and tigers would be replaced by anti-tigers, and humans would be able to ride around on them like horses and they'd get on very well. That the sea salt would turn into lemonade and you could just drink the sea. His schemes were based, he said, but there is an important thing about him, and I want to emphasize this again. Owen talks about changing human nature. For Fourier, his schemes were based upon, as he put it, utilizing the passions, just as nature has given them to us, and without in any way changing them. Why? Because God did what he did. Fourier was seeking to overcome the narrowing, circumscribing, and distorting impact on the human spirit that proceeded inevitably from the unremitting dedication to one craft, or the reduction of labour to an unthinkingly mechanical procedure. He had, therefore, a theory of proletarian psychology. Fourier thought that the wage worker hates his job and wants to become instead a productive property owner. Workers, like any other human, wish to own the means by which they lived. But for the worker, ownership could only be achieved through cooperation. Individual ownership was no longer possible for the great mass of people. And he went on, the spirit of ownership is the strongest lever we know to motivate the civilized. We can, without exaggeration, estimate that the owner of property produces twice as much as the wage slave. Daily, we see the evidence of this fact. Wage earners working slowly and committing shocking blunders compared to the diligence of those operating on their own behalf. It is then the first problem of political economy to work out how to transform all wage workers into co-interested or associated owners. Interestingly, later on, Karl Kautsky makes a similar point that he says peasants and petty bourgeois work much harder than proletarians because they're interested in what they're doing and they feel an interest in their own work in the way that proletarians don't. There is always a good deal of bizarre speculation in Fourier's writings, though some of it possibly may have been as much satire as anything else. And Fourier had no expectation that the proletariat would ever be able to emancipate itself or even be particularly open to his ideas. He relied instead upon the inexorable working out of the scientific laws mandated by him. Sismondi, Lamennais, and Fourier were all critics of industrial modernity. Count Claude Henri de Saint-Simon, 1760 to 1825, was quite different in this respect. Born in Paris, Saint-Simon renounced his aristocratic title at the beginning of the Great Revolution and instead involved himself in speculation in the sale of confiscated royalist assets. Good way to make money. Accused of corruption, he was arrested in November 1793, but luckily enough, given circumstances, released a year later. From 1803, he was publishing pamphlets calling for scholars and industrialists collaboratively to run society and sharply criticizing the idle classes of nobles and bureaucrats. After the Restoration, he appealed to Louis XVIII to entrust the control of the country's finances to the leading industrialists and bankers. He positively embraced and celebrated the dawning age of mass industrial production and hierarchical management. Saint-Simon's heroes, therefore, were not the workers, but the managers. He had no nostalgia, however, for social conservatism. He dismissed the forces of reaction, the nobility, the soldiery, and the bureaucracy as les oisifs. The agents of social modernity were les industriels. Saint-Simon argued that history had always been driven by the conflict between classes, specifically between the productive and unproductive classes. But the tendency was increasingly away from class struggle and towards cooperation between classes under the aegis of benign and knowledgeable experts. He proposed, therefore, a technocratic rule by a new elite of industrialists and scientists for the greater good of the common working people. Only in his very last works, notably Le Nouveau Christianisme, 1825, did he tentatively suggest that the working class itself might prove to be a fruitful constituency for the propagation of his ideas. We've seen this again and again. We get these people who look to the intellectuals, ruling elites, whatever, as the people they really want to address. They get ignored and they end up talking to the working class instead. Even then, at the end of his life, Saint-Simon never believed that the labouring poor could be effective agents of their own emancipation. Saint-Simon proposed the kind of planned economy, but he's against the socialisation of the means of production and wished to see entrepreneurs continue to receive healthy returns on their investments. As the years wore on, however, Saint-Simon laid increasing stress on the conflict between classes. And this tendency in his writings was taken up and emphasised by his immediate successors, after his death in 1825. Armand Bazard, 1791 to 1832. Emile Barrault, 1799 to 1883, surely, 1889, lived a long time. And Barthélemy Prosper Afontaine, 1796 to 1864. All of these kind of Saint-Simons went further than Saint-Simon by actually denouncing and calling for the abolition of private capital, and in particular, inherited capital, inherited wealth. Their exposition of Saint-Simon's doctrine, as they understood it, was published in 1829 and marked actually a fundamental development in the socialist conception of the wage-earning working class. This work, they focused their attack on the private inheritance of wealth. Barrault and Afontaine argued that the institution of inheritance meant that the science of wealth were able to perpetuate themselves generation by generation in idleness. So if you like, the first generation, maybe the second generation of capitalists were kind of useful because they're dynamic, they were organized things, they're like Saint-Simon's industriel, but actually as their kids inherit the wealth, they just become idle rentiers, living off a capital, organizing, contributing very little to production. And the flip side of this was that everybody else inherited poverty. This hereditary misery, as they said, attached itself to the class of the proletarians, as they called it. And in so doing, it's really Barrault and Afontaine who make the term proletarians a popular, well-known term in 1829. The proletariat were characterized by their formal freedom and their actual exploitation by those who owned the means of production. Trapped and degraded by this exploitation, the proletariat had no way to buy themselves into independence and inheritable property or wealth. And so the perfect vicious circle was completed. Inheritance was concentrating wealth into the hands of an idle few. The power of the capitalist over the wage earner was ever increasing, and the possibility of proletarian escape from a hand-to-mouth existence was ever diminishing. The authors concluded, therefore, that property, rather than being a constant to history, was always subject and should be subject to intervention from the moralist and the legislator, and could be so again. The idle rentier who lived off the ownership of capital must be dispossessed by the state, which would become the inheritor of wealth. So fundamentally, they propose a nationalisation of inheritance, of 100% death tax. The government then could institute a rational organisation of production to benefit the greater number. In the coming society, people would be rewarded in proportion to their effort and ability, not to the good fortune of their parents and grandparents. Certainly, Barrault and Afontaine did not see the proletariat as a class that could run society itself. They proposed instead bankers in particular as an efficient and disinterested ruling class. It would, however, they became increasingly to believe, require the legislative sanction and the education of the workers to prepare the way for association under the benign oversight of les industriels. So it is not Saint-Simon, but his successors who introduced the idea of the proletariat into political discourse. They also made a powerful, and for many workers, at least in larger enterprises, a compelling argument that there was no moral sanction for capitalists growing fat on the ownership of wealth, a wealth not earned but simply inherited and then passively invested and multiplied by the labour of the wage earner. The Saint-Simon school, as a document of 1830, probably written by Bazard, put it, opposed the institution of property only insofar as it perpetuates for the few the ungodly privilege of idleness, that is, the privilege of living off the labour of his fellow man. Now, the Saint-Simon school fairly quickly broke into squabbling factions. Afontaine insisted in developing the creed as literally a new religion. And he made a big deal too about proclaiming sex equality, to the horror of many erstwhile disciples. Some were concerned by the elitist and managerialist ethos. Philippe Bouquet broke from the Saint-Simeons and established what he called a Catholicio-revolutionaire tendency, promoting worker cooperatives to moralize the proletariat by giving the workers' associations the means to acquire the property of their tools, as he put it. And therefore, as Bouquet put it, bringing into existence the Republic of the Workshop, which becomes a very resonant term.
Who's this guy?
Bouquet's guy, Philippe Bouquet, B-U-C-H-E-Z. And he talks about the Republic of the Workshop, which becomes a very resonant term on the French left in the 1830s and 40s. Bouquet established in 1840 a newspaper, L'Atelier, basically means the workshop, to persuade working men to establish cooperative workshops by their own efforts. L'Atelier recommended that they educate themselves with the aid of evening classes run by the Catholic Christian Brothers. But turning now to, does he count as utopian socialist or not? Anyway, I'm going to mention him a bit. Louis Auguste Blanqui, 1805 to 1881. Not a kind of dream or a future organization of society, so much as a dedicated professional revolutionary, as he was from his youth. Blanqui participated in the 1830 revolution that overthrew Charles X as a zealous and radical republican. Thereafter, he moved in the direction of communism, as he called it, understood not so much as a specific form of social organization, but rather as a term for a movement of the propertyless masses to overthrow the old social order in pursuit of radical egalitarianism. So communism, as the term comes to be understood in the early terms, is not so much how do you organize the future, it's more what kind of movement are we talking about? We're not talking here about looking to the state or looking to philanthropists to organize a better society. Rather, we're looking to a movement of the propertyless. He was, with others like Barbès, leader and organizer of secret conspiracies geared towards preparation for the insurrection. First, the Society of Friends, later called the Society of Seasons. A split off from the Society of Seasons would later come to be known as the Communist League. I think you know who writes the manifesto of the Communist League. Often imprisoned, Blanqui was incarcerated. He is often imprisoned. Blanqui is incarcerated for some 30 years of his life. He accrued a semi-mythical reputation as an indomitable and hard-headed revolutionist. Blanqui later on would find himself, as usual, in jail during the Paris Commune, but his spirit motivated the leadership of this of the Commune in 1871, and they clamoured for his release. Prime Minister Thiers refused to swap Blanqui for hostages held by the Commune. He felt a free Blanqui was too dangerous. Nonetheless, he is pardoned in 1879 and died shortly thereafter, amazingly not in jail. Blanqui combined Jacobin revolutionary ideas with the new conception of a socialism based upon the proletariat. At first, Blanqui was inclined to divide French society into three: the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the people. He appears to have been inspired by the rising of the wage workers of Lyon in 1834, however, to reconfigure his analysis so that it was no longer a conflict between the people and the ruling classes on the one hand, but rather a conflict between the proletariat and their capitalist exploiters, a duel to the death between profit and wages, as he himself put it. However, even then, he felt that the wage-earning proletariat, so motivated, were only one component of the popular Republican revolutionary movement. In January 1832, Blanqui was put on trial by the authorities and made a celebrated speech of accusation against his accusers. He proudly identified himself as a proletarian. Given the circumstances, this is no doubt a not entirely polished disquisition, and Blanqui gave a rather heterodox definition of the proletariat in France as including 25 million peasants and 5 million workers. In an article 2 years later at Leisure, however, and more in line with the general understanding of the proletariat as wage workers, not in possession of the means of production, he wrote, "He is not free who, deprived of the instruments of labour, remains at the mercy of the privileged who are its owners. It is this and not the domination of this or that political constitution which enserfs the masses. Inheritance of land and capital puts people under the owner's yoke. They have no other freedom than to choose their master." In 1852, he characterised proletarians as those without property, or at least without serious properties, living only on the meagre product of their arms. It's their ability to work day by day. Blanqui in 1832 stressed that the masses were motivated not by low monetary interests, but by the nobler passions of the soul, the aspirations of elevated morality. This noble simplicity, however, meant that the masses were in turn easily misled. It is the duty, therefore, of a dedicated revolutionary elite to give it leadership to this willing but fickle mass. An 1836 oath required all members of Blanqui's revolutionary conspiracy to emancipate the proletariat in a social rather than merely political revolution. By 1838, indeed, a police spy reported to his superiors that the recruitment among the ill-conditioned members of the bourgeoisie has been replaced by recruitment from the scum of the popular class. Revolutionary conspiracy had become, it seemed, a working class affair because, as the police spy put it, the bourgeois element altogether has abandoned illegal means. Blanqui was inclined to see the proletariat as a raw material for Republican revolution. A form of communism to accommodate their needs would be built in the aftermath of revolution. Some of his co-conspirators, however, were more inclined to see the wage workers as deriving from their own conditions of experience an actual programme for social transformation. Bernard Aristide Martin, known as Martin Bernard, was one of the leaders of the Society of Seasons, a Blanquist organisation, himself a worker and typographer. He echoed Bouquet's, the Catholic cooperativist, in calling for a struggle against industrial feudalism and in pursuit of the cooperative republic of the workshop. This linking of general democratisation to worker self-determination at the workplace was particularly appealing to the many small workshops that characterised French manufacturing at this time. Etienne Cabet, 1788 to 1856, was a Christian communist, as he described himself. And indeed, it's Cabet more than anyone else who popularises the term communism. Cabet was a stern critic, however, of Blanqui's insurrectionism, and he rejected violence emphatically. If I held revolution in my hand, I would keep it tightly closed, even if I then had to die in exile. Cabet had been a barrister and a secretary to the Minister of Justice until dismissed in 1831 for his part in fundraising for Polish insurgents against Russian rule. Elected to the National Assembly in 1830, he began publishing essays and pamphlets on the political situation. And as a result, he is arrested in 1832, sentenced to 5 years, but acquitted on appeal. To avoid further trouble, he made his way to London in 1834, staying there for 5 years. Here, he became acquainted with the ideas of Robert Owen. For French readers, he wrote his famous book, Voyage en Icarie, Voyage to Icarie, a classically utopian work, a utopian depiction of the communist society. He attracted a considerable popular following, but himself was opposed to political or class struggle ideas. Cabet advised workers instead to take themselves off to the United States, where they might find a communist colony. In 1848, as good as his word, he led a party to Texas to establish the new Icarie. This communist colony did not succeed, and Cabet spent the rest of his life in actively socialist but mostly unproductive political activity. Cabet was a critic of Babeuf's conspiracy because he believed that by their strenuous class struggle politics, they frightened the rich. In fact, he argued there is no fundamental division between the proletarian and the employer. I want to attack one of the most fatal prejudices, one that makes enemies of workers and masters, of workers and bourgeois. I want to show you that the current organisation is as vicious for masters or bourgeois as much as for workers and proletarians. They are also its victims. And their common interest is not to hate and be at war, but to unite, to ally, to associate and to fraternise, to introduce a new organisation of work that can make them all equally happy. Not all who came under the influence of Cabet were so convinced that Blanquet's desire to mobilise the proletariat against their oppressors had nothing to offer. Theodore Desailly, who associated with Blanquet, was more clearly a socialist intent on proletarian self-emancipation. And in 1843, he wrote Code de la Humanité as a guide to revolutionary measures to be taken in the event of proletarian revolution, in which he included, as you might expect, the immediate abolition of inheritance and the seizure of property from rich enemies of the revolution. This became a standard text for materialist communists, as they were known, meaning those who banked upon an egalitarian revolution, which would arise out of a furious rising of the wage workers. Desailly broke from Cabet because he rejected Cabet's class collaborationism. Workers should not appeal to the bourgeoisie for aid. A drop of balm in an ocean of pain. The proletariat does not need charity, but instruments of labour, raw materials, insurance institutions, more than they need the benefits of education and indeed political emancipation. Like Martin Bernard, Desailly wanted to see workers being given the means by which they could independently labour. Without this, they are at the mercy of masters and the fluctuations of the market. Insecurity, he felt, was the cardinal proletarian condition that needed to be overcome. He proposed, therefore, as did Cabet, colonies of cooperative production, both within France and in the New World. The success would not depend upon any unnatural spirit of self-denial from its participants, but rather would devolve from human nature. Desailly wanted to see associations of workers animated by the joint principles of individual self-help and mutual support, self and others, as he put it. Desailly saw the proletariat as natural friends of equality, but easily distracted by the clamour of radical agitators seeking their ear to distract them from their true interests. It is important, therefore, Desailly thought, that the working class emancipate itself from the bickering of purely political radicals, and they should attend to the social question rather than the political question. Proletarians, the opportunity to regenerate the people sometimes comes only 1 hour in a century. He mistrusted the contemporary socialist ideologues, who he thought were excessively pacifist. Instead, he introduced his readers to thinkers who'd been influential in the Enlightenment, Campanella, Rousseau, and Morelli, with the epigram, pour the truth on the head of the proletariat, owe them this baptism. This merger of socialism and the incipient worker movement in the form of neo-Jacobin communism did not go without challenge, and enormously influential was Louis Blanc, 1811 to 1882. Blanc had been born in Spain, son of a civil servant, and came to France in 1833, acting for a couple of years as a tutor for an industrialist family. From 1834, he began writing for the Democratic press and was a leading campaigner for an extension of the franchise. Blanc was a moderate, believing in gradual reform and the avoidance of violent conflict. Unlike the Saint-Simons, however, he was passionately committed to democracy and universal suffrage. This, he believed, would transform the state into an instrument for progress. The democratic social republic, which he called for, and he popularised that term, would not take over and plan the economy, but would rather facilitate cooperative production by associations of workers. Starting up capital would be provided to ateliers nationaux, national workshops, which, as they attracted skilled, well-motivated workers, would soon stand on their own feet. These associations would not only handle production, but also necessary welfare provision, which, along with the right to work, would give labour a security equivalent to private property. The monopoly of capital in the hands of employers would be ended, and in due course, capitalist enterprises would dwindle as wage labourers would decamp to become cooperative producers in the atelier. As he wrote in his widely awaited 1839 work, The Organisation of Labour, we want a government that intervenes in industry because in a regime of inequality within which we are still vegetating, there are weak persons who need a social force to protect them, the state. In due course, however, the atelier would become independent, and the state as such could then retreat from social life as the producing citizenry learned to manage its own affairs, if you like, the withering away of the state. Someday, if the dearest hope of our heart is not mistaken, he predicted, a day will come when a strong and active government is no longer needed, because there will no longer be inferior and subordinate classes in society. Until then, the establishment of a tutelary authority is essential. Blanc had a very considerable influence, not least in popularising the idea of the organisation of labour, by which he meant the establishment of cooperative workshops in a balanced market of mutual exchange without capitalist interference, or without capitalist intermediaries. This organisation of labour being at the core of the socialist project. He had been influenced by another democratic socialist and follower of Fourier, Victor Considerant. And through him, actually, through Considerant, Fourier had a greater influence in 48 radicalism, the radicalism in the 1848 revolution, than did Saint-Simon. Prosper Victor Considerant had been educated at the École Polytechnique Paris, a very elite institution. He entered the army's engineering section and fought in the conquest of Algeria in 1830. He was an early and enthusiastic disciple of Fourier, seeing his teachings as being in line with Christian ethics. If Jesus of Nazareth were to return today, he would become a disciple of Fourier. Who knows? He said in a speech at the Hôtel de Ville. Considerant left the army and trained as a printer, and this allowed him to expound Fourier's philosophy, which he did at great length in the multi-volume Destiny Sociale, published between 1834 and 1844, though he sheared off the more fantastical speculations of his master, so no more Antilions or Oceans of Lemonade, unfortunately. He founded and edited the daily Démocratie Pacifique between 1841 and 1851. He promoted the Reformation of France, breaking with those Fourierists who aimed only at establishing independent utopian colonies, phalansteries. He combined appealing directly to workers with a message of class harmony and deploring revolution as destructive and destabilizing. In 1848, Considerant was elected to the National Assembly as a democratic socialist for the Department of Le Loire. After the failure of the 1848 revolutions, Considerant was accused of treason and forced to flee to Brussels. From there, he emigrated to Texas, where he was involved in the Fourierist colony La Réunion near San Antonio. This existed between 1854 and 1869. At first, he was optimistic, finding less demoralization than he is used to in France. Poverty in Texas, he said, is not a resigned and static poverty. Rather, it is a point of departure. Still, the venture ultimately went bankrupt, and eventually in 1859, Considerant returned to Paris, where he joined the International Working Men's Association, First International, and supported the Paris Commune. He ended his days as a well-known veteran and a Latin Quarter character, easily recognizable in his quaint costumes. For Considerant, greater social equality and the right to work a resonant slogan he did much to popularize, would create the stability and security for workers they needed to make themselves independent citizens. By the organisation of work, each individual would become socially emancipated, independent and free. Echoing a slogan which had been made famous by the Lyon Workers' Rising of 34 and 36, I think, Considerant wrote that the great cry of social war is to live working or to die fighting. He went on, with good reason, the working classes don't believe that they must forever be commodities with their prices rising or falling as if they were merely proletarian raw material in the marketplace. They want society to guarantee them life and work. They are beginning to understand that the right to work, as a right no less sacred than the right to property. It was incumbent, therefore, in society to recognise, guarantee, protect, and reorganise, and to organise the right to work, which itself is the only property of the masses. The misery of the proletariat, Considerant said, threatened class revolution, but this would be a disaster. Proletarian revolution would be violent, destructive, despoiling by force and law the wealthy for the benefit of the poor, and owners for the benefit of the proletarians. Such a destructive outcome, however, could be avoided with a rational organisation of industry which rewarded capital and talent proportionately to their share of the production of wealth. One could see ease and well-being pervading all classes. Close to Considerant was Flora Tristan, 1803 to 1844. Born in Paris, Tristan's father was of aristocratic Peruvian Spanish descent. His marriage to a French woman was not recognized, meaning that Flora and her siblings were legally illegitimate. She had an early sense, therefore, of being a social outcast, strengthened after the failure of her marriage to her employer, who deprived her of her 2 children. She fled France pregnant with a third child and travelled to Peru, seeking access to the wealth of her aristocratic relatives. On her arrival back in Europe in 1835, she mingled with the socialists and artists of Paris and London. At the time, she was being pursued by her hideous former husband, who even attempted to assassinate her in December 1837. Dramatically vivacious with an extraordinary life experience and a high intelligence, her small Paris flat became a favourite meeting place of socialist intellectuals. Flora Tristan died tragically young, taking ill in 1844, while touring France to meet up with and to stir up the workers to their own self-organisation. Due to her heightened emotional style, Tristan has generally been deprecated as a thinker. For George Lichtheim, the kind of Frankfurt School conservative Marxist intellectual historian of socialism, a bit of an asshole to be honest, Lichtheim, described Flora Tristan's work as not part of the history of socialist theory. Tristan, however, is deeply interested in how workers actually worked. She visited Britain in 1840, where she visited Parliament. She went in the visitors' gallery. Women weren't allowed there, so she had to disguise herself to get in. And she saw the great Irish politician Daniel O'Connell speak. Said he was very impressive and ugly. She visited a factory in London and she attended a Chartist meeting. Upon her return to France, Tristan read the worker writer Adolphe Boyer, who had written of the artisanal compagnage. These were artisanal workers in France would travel from town to town to town to town, learning their trade. So it's a kind of worker network of self-support, because you go from town to town, you go to the local worker compagnage headquarters and they'd put you up for the night, tell you where to work and so on. So there's a kind of pre-existing worker self-organisation. And this culture of solidarity and nationwide, even international networks of organisation inspired Tristan with the notion of proposing a workers' union, She is also, I think, in this influenced by the O'Connellite mass movement in Ireland. Now, Tristan's proposal for a workers' union included a coherent theory of proletarian class consciousness, a natural tendency towards collectivism as arising out of the social circumstances of the proletarian mode of labour. For workers who had only their arms as property, that is, their ability to labour, the right to work, this term, was indispensable for their right to live. The right to work, in turn, required an organisation of labour, and this could only be achieved by a workers' union. So in brief terms, it's a complete kind of schematic of proletarian consciousness giving rise to a mode of production, which in turn gives rise to a form of proletarian class organisation. Turning finally to Germany, it is Moses Hess, a self-taught intellectual, quite posh background, he felt guilty about this, married a working class seamstress, partly out of guilt for being so posh, got annoyed because the working class seamstress had sex with Frederick Engels, but nonetheless stuck with her. They had a happy enough married life. And it is Moses Hess, interesting in lots of ways. He's one of the earliest socialist Zionist thinkers. So he's still well known in Israel, looked upon well in Israel as a precursor Zionist. Hess, he also published effectively the first book on socialism in Germany in 1837. And Hess argued that socialism in Germany could not find its inspiration from those associations of German craftsmen, many of whom were not even in Germany, but working in places like France. But rather, German socialism arose out of intellectual philosophical reasoning within Germany, that arose as an intellectual current rather than a social current. Modern socialism as an international phenomenon, therefore, combined proletarian instinct, most highly developed in Britain, and intellectual ratiocination, which had reached a peak in Germany. Socialism arose, in other words, from the practical necessity of the proletariat externally, in France and most importantly Britain, and by the theoretical necessity of science internally within Germany. Certain parallels, this notion in Marx and Engels. However, there's little doubt that emerging socialism, the emerging socialism of German artisans, mostly based in foreign countries, notably France and Britain, did have its own autonomous dynamism. Notably, Wilhelm Weitling, 1808 to 71, who combined socialism and Christianity to fashion a millennial communism. And Weitling was a member of the German travelling journeyman working class, who typically travelled for work as far afield as Italy, Switzerland, England, and France. Transport and migration is not a new thing. He remarked himself that of the carpenters, shoemakers, and tailors who worked in Paris, more than half were German. Though he is closest in spirit to the craft worker, Weitling argued that it was the wage worker who is most likely to be the revolutionary, because the craftsman is more bound to his master than to his fellow worker. Ordinary working people, Weitling argued, were motivated by a desire to acquire knowledge and skills to increase the value of their basic property of labour. The fundamental human instinct, which is sharply expressed in the working class, therefore, was the desire for knowledge. For man cannot enjoy what he does not have, and he cannot have without knowing where and how to get it. Therefore, it is the desire for knowledge which is the main driver of the social organism. The technical inventions of the British Industrial Revolution, Weitling insisted, derived not from abstract philosophers, but from ordinary working men. He's not very wrong about that. But knowledge and creative genius can only ever be the possession of a minority, and this ruled out government by universal suffrage. The majority is not enlightened enough to judge and understand talent. But while workers may wish to improve themselves to self-educate in the first instance, it was their revolutionary despair that would drive the revolutionary process. And strikingly, he argued that it was the criminal classes, the lumpen proletariat, who should be seen as both the victims and the avengers, not as moral outlaws. No one convicted by the courts of law in contemporary society is to be despised, he said. The revolutionary class would not be capable of self-government on the morrow of the revolution. Instead, a revolutionary elite would need first to suppress opposition to the revolution. For the transition period, the dictatorship is necessary to establish the new organization. A technocratic elite in the Saint-Simeon mode would eventually displace class government with simple administration. And Weitling proposed a Dreimann-Rath Council of Three, consisting of the greatest scientists to run society. As the workers lacked clarity about the nature of their exploitation and how it might be abolished, and the organization, an organization of dedicated revolutionaries is therefore necessary. And to this end, Weitling set up the League of the Just, later to become the Communist League, comprising mostly German workers in various countries. And this is not so much an organization of the class at large as a vanguard of idealists set in triggering class revolution. Weitling, however, was dismissive of the canting intellectuals and certainly expected to find most revolutionaries from the ranks of the propertyists and outcasts. Weitling espoused what Lorenz von Stein, 1815 to 1890, would call crude communism. Von Stein was a conservative German scholar steeped in Hegelianism. He studied at the University of Paris between 1841 and 1842. Whilst in Paris, he became fascinated with the French socialist movement and therefore wrote a book to introduce its ideas to German readers, published in 1842. A book which proved to be an immediate publishing smash. Here, von Stein predicted that the era of purely political movements in France is over. The next revolution now can only be social. Von Stein's theme was that socialism, and more particularly communism, as he defined it, were intimately related with the modern wage-earning working class. And therefore, he begins his book with a chapter entitled Das Proletariat. Considering the material conditions of the industrial working class were sufficiently known and specific measures to remedy their lot insufficiently developed, von Stein deliberately kept his account, in our eyes, rather annoyingly general and theoretical, but popular at the time, particularly in German kind of intellectual circles. Von Stein acknowledged the Roman antecedents to the term proletariat, but sharply differentiated this from the modern proletariat, who, he said, wants to work contentedly, efficiently, and regularly, but who also wants a fair wage for their work. This modern class he defined as relying upon, as able to rely only upon its ability to labour, what we'd later call labour power, because it lacked education or property as the basis of its social existence. And it was precisely this lack which animated the proletarian socialist instinct. Proletarian dreamy hopes and plans for the general distribution of goods, property, and intelligence to salvage their insecurity provided the common principle behind all variants of socialism and communism, despite their differences. As such, the proletariat is in a state of contradiction with the laws of civilization, modern society. So far, he argued, only England and France had a proletariat in the proper sense of the term, and its development might yet be avoided in Germany. When he says England, incidentally, he includes Ireland, because he includes, in the relevant footnote, he's got newspaper articles being quoted from Limerick. So von Stein chose to survey French socialism and communism, where proletarian ideas, fertilized with the revolutionary years of the 1790s, were most developed. Here, the ideal of social equality was most evidently in contradiction with the reality of proletarian debasement and personal underdevelopment forced by the pressures of the free market division of labour. For socialists, von Stein argued, the organisation of industry had as its goal the salvaging of individuals from stultifying detailed work and would unify individual will and social solidarity. The completion, early done here, the completion of each personality was the socialist communist ideal. Stein was really worried that German Hegelians might well find such a programme attractive, even in the absence of a German proletariat. Communism, von Stein said, is not a developed system or even a principle. Rather, communism is the instinctive hostility to any social inequality which was inherent in the proletariat. Communism shows itself in the rawest form in the subordination of everything to the naked sensual well-being of the people, and in particular of the proletariat. Its particular representative was Babuvism, the tradition stretching back to Gracchus Babeuf, which had emerged again through Buonarroti and eventuated in the Blancist secret societies of the 1830s. Stein, being a conservative Hegelian, with full faith in the disinterested servants of the state, favoured a social monarchy to solve proletarian disaffection. Moses Hess, who had recently converted Friedrich Engels and through him Karl Marx, wrote a review of Stein's book in which he bemoaned his unremittingly negative view of communism as an unsophisticated movement of proletarian instinct. Von Stein wanted communism to be fancy-dancy German Hegelian ideas. Von Stein's work, nonetheless, became the authoritative introduction to socialist thinking in the German lands, and indeed even further afield, and the concept of the very concept of the proletariat for German speakers. In a stage-managed trial of communists organised at the behest of the Prussian crown in 1852, von Stein's work was introduced by the prosecution and held up as a conspectus of the destructive ideas proposed by Karl Marx's fellow thinkers. Marx responded by differentiating the views of his Communist Party from the presentation given in von Stein's well-known work. Marx said, in Stein's compendium, many sorts of communism are to be found, but not German critical communism, as elaborated in the Communist Manifesto. It is in the fourth section of the manifesto that Marx and Engels have clarified that while their communist tendency certainly based itself upon proletarian instincts, it nevertheless also supported democratic alliances to push back absolutism, with the Social Democrats in France represented by Ledger Roland and Léon Blanc, the radicals in Switzerland with the national and agrarian revolutionaries in Poland, with the radical bourgeoisie in Germany. This specific brand of Marx and Engels, as communism, was defined by its willingness to labour everywhere for the union and agreement of all the democratic parties of all countries. It would appear that Marx and Engels accepted von Stein's definition of communism as fundamentally that which derived from proletarian instincts, but rejected a class egoism, that the communism of Marx and Engels was not simply the reflection of a social movement, it was a political strategy. We shall leave it there.